Alright, topic 8.5, eutrophication. So, let's get to it. You guys pretty much already have these in your notes, and that's okay. I just wanted to go over it again. And so, eutrophication is when there is an excess concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus that is leached by rainwater. Now, where is that nitrogen and phosphorus coming from? A lot of times it's coming from agricultural fields, from all the excess fertilizer. It can be coming from catho. Remember, catho is a concentrated animal feeding operation, a feedlot, from all the excess manure. Okay? So, leached by rain. Okay, and that's going to be, like I said, from agriculture. Lots of fertilizers. And cathos. Increased manure. And remember, when we have cathos, we might have what's called a manure lagoon. And a manure lagoon is just like a kind of like a swimming pool of poo. Like a lot of pig farms and chicken farms have this sort of thing. And that can sometimes overflow, or even if the lining isn't very good, it can leach into the soil. And so it'll eventually make its way into a waterway. Okay? So that extra nutrient, which you would imagine would be a good thing, like, oh, nutrients, not really. That's that leach into waterway. And you've got a couple of things that will happen. Okay? So let's go in the left direction first. So the excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, feed the algae. The algae is going to be on the surface of the water, obviously. Anything that needs to photosynthesize is going to be on the surface, because why? Because that's where the sunlight is, right? So that causes the algae to overgrow. That causes the surface to kind of be blanketed with algae, like a carpet of algae. So when that happens, then the sunlight cannot penetrate to the bottom of the waterway. At the bottom of the waterway is where you have a lot of your plants. And so when the sunlight can't penetrate to the bottom, then those plants are not getting the sun they need to photosynthesize. Okay, so like I said, there's no photosynthesis. Occurring in the water. So therefore, the waterway is going to have less oxygen. So this causes a decrease in dissolved oxygen. So a lot of times we call dissolved oxygen just DO. Okay, the waterway then becomes hypoxic. Sorry, let me write that a little bit nicer. Hypoxic. Hypoxic means less oxygen. Sorry, lacking oxygen. That means definition. All right, so let me highlight some words. The word leach, let's highlight that. That means carried away by water, by rainwater. Okay. Oops. Let's not forget what CAFOs are. Those concentrated animal feeding operations. Okay. Algal bloom. Dissolved oxygen. And hypoxic. Okay? So these are words that you're going to have to work to try to remember. And this is a process that you're going to have to work to try to remember as well. Okay? The waterway becomes hypoxic, which means lacking in oxygen. And that's what hypoxic means. Alright, so on the right side, so simultaneously as the left side is happening, the excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, right, feed the algae. Same thing, right? Okay. Now, when they feed the algae, you get the algal bloom. So you still get the algal bloom, but eventually, since that algae is an R-selected organism, it blooms quick and dies fast, right? So there's going to be a whole lot of them propagating really, really quick, but then they die really super fast. So eventually, the algae dies. And whenever there's death, then there's always decomposers. And whenever there's a lot of death, then there's a lot more decomposers, because ultimately you've given the decomposers more food. And these decomposers are also R-selected. So when there's more food, their population increases as well. So you get an increase in decomposers. And then the decomposers use up more oxygen, dissolved oxygen. So let me explain that. The decomposers are not photosynthetic. They're respirers. They respire. So when you respire, just like you, we breathe in oxygen. Well, these decomposers, whether they're bacteria or fungi or even protists, whatever, these decomposers, they breathe oxygen. And since there's so many of them now, because there's so much death, now they're breathing even more oxygen. Okay? So due to respiration. That's called biological oxygen demand. Okay, so let's write that down. So the amount of oxygen needed by decomposers is called biological oxygen demand. Okay, or BOD. BOD. Okay, that is the definition of biological oxygen demand. The amount of oxygen needed by decomposers as BOD, biological oxygen demand. As biological oxygen demand increases, dissolved oxygen decreases. Why? Because these decomposers are breathing in, sucking in more oxygen. Okay? So these two have an inverse relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. Okay, so as BOD goes up, O2 goes down. That's bad. That's bad. That means you have a lot of decomposers because you have a lot of death. And these decomposers are going to suck up all the oxygen because they are respirers. Okay? So this causes the dissolved oxygen to decrease. Waterway becomes hypoxic. Again, there's that word, hypoxic, meaning lacking oxygen. Both of these are happening simultaneously. Okay? And so all of that connected leads to one thing. Eutrophication, a eutrophied waterway. Okay, so that all leads to eutrophication. When that waterway becomes hypoxic, you get what's called a fish kill. Why do you get a fish kill? Because there's no oxygen. Fish have gills. Those gills act like our lungs, except that instead of being on the outside of water, they're on the inside of water. And so they're going to breathe in dissolved oxygen. Not water. They don't breathe in water. They breathe in dissolved oxygen. Please understand that the dissolved oxygen is separate from the H2O, because gases can be dissolved in liquids, like a Coke. So you drink a Coke and it's all fizzy because there are gases dissolved in it. Okay, so there's dissolved oxygen gas in the water. Okay, and that's separate from the H2O. So we're not talking about the O and the H2O. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the separate oxygen molecules that are in the water. And fish are able to use their gills to breathe in that that excess oxygen, that dissolved oxygen, that gas that's dissolved in the water. But when you have this scenario, and you've got a high biological oxygen demand, and that decreases that dissolved oxygen, and the water becomes hypoxic, then there's less dissolved oxygen. And then the fish suffocate and die. Okay? So when we have that, we have a fish kill. We see a lot of fish kills off the coast of Florida, or because you have a lot of farms, sugarcane farms and things like that, that are using a lot of fertilizers, and those fertilizers do leach. And don't forget that the Mississippi River empties out in the Gulf of Mexico. And so when the Mississippi River empties out, it takes all those excess nutrients, because guess what? There's a whole bunch of farms, a whole bunch of agricultural industry near the Mississippi River, because there's water there, so that makes sense. You want to farm near water. And there's a lot of CAFOs near the Mississippi River, so the Mississippi River is actually taking in a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus, and it is moving all that excess nitrogen and all that excess phosphorus into the Gulf of Mexico. And when it gets there, then all of this lovely stuff happens, okay, in the bays and so on and so forth, and you end up a lot of times with a fish kill. And so there's quite a few fish kills off the coast of Florida and off the coast of Georgia and all those places. And so you can see, like, from NASA can see it from space, you can see algal blooms along the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico because, well, all of this, okay? And that water is highly hypoxic, and so you get a lot of those fish kills, okay? All right, so turning to the next page, have some other stuff to go through with you. All right, so what I wanted to go over was how to test for this sort of thing, how we test for it, and it's called an oxygen SAG. So let's go through that. All right, so methods of testing, that says testing, for contaminants or excess nutrients in the water. First, extra nitrogen or extra phosphorus on farms and CAFOs can cause an increase in algal growth. We just went over that. Like I said, algal growth has a short lifespan. It's an R-selected species, so it will die. When the algae dies, decomposers, typically bacteria in the water, their population increases. And because these bacteria are respirers, we get a decrease in dissolved oxygen. And an increase in biological oxygen immune. Remember, when one of these goes up, the other one goes down. So how do we test for this? So we would incubate, which means grow, a sample of that water then test the dissolved oxygen levels. Now we could do that now. Like, you guys could go to a pond and grab some water and let it just sit. And when I say grow, I mean allow all the microorganisms to just populate in that sample. then compare to the population before the incubation. That's before incubation. And so what you're looking for is if the dissolved oxygen decreases, then that means the BOD has, if the dissolved oxygen has decreased, that means the BOD has increased. Okay, you could also test the dissolved oxygen of the water directly. So in other words, you could just go to a river or a lake or whatever, a waterway, and you could just test the dissolved oxygen just to see if it's high or low. If it's low, that means BOD is high. Rivers are good. Let me tell you why. Rivers are constantly moving. And when they're constantly moving, that means that they're aerating. In other words, they're picking up oxygen from the air. So therefore, they have better aeration. They're less likely to get, that says aeration, by the way. They're less likely to become eutrophied because they don't just sit there. And so the result of that is that they recover quicker from oxygen depleting processes. Like eutrophication. That's not to say they can't be eutrophied, but they'll recover faster. So what you want to do is you want to go what's called downstream from a point source. Now, point source is an actual source of pollution. Now, that could be a sewage drain, right? So literally the pollution is, the sewage is literally pouring into this river, okay? So we want to go downstream. So, but downstream all the way down. So going not upstream where the pollution is, but go all the way down from your point source. So when I say point source, I mean the actual source. Like you can point at it, and that's why we say point. You can point at it and say, that's where the toxin is coming from. So the point source. You're going to get better detection. In other words, you're going to be able to figure out whether or not this water is eutrophied if you go further from the point source. So that oxygen decline downstream has a name, and that's called oxygen sag. Alright, so make sure you highlight that. So that's a new thing. So we're going to draw a graph real quick. And if you guys would get like two different colors, that would be perfect. So we're gonna draw a graph, and if you guys have two different colors, that's great. I'm gonna grab a ruler. Probably not that necessary, but I'm probably being a little extra. Oh well. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and draw a line here. And then I'm going to give myself some space about to right here. I'm going to scoop my notebook up. Then draw myself another line to about right here. And then I'll give myself another line about right here. And then I'm going to go right in the middle. Well, no, maybe about right there. Yeah, that's good. Just like that. Alright, I'm going to get some Post-its. I have some Post-its, so if you need some, that's fine. So I'm going to grab some Post-its. But I'm going to start off right here. So I'm going to start up upstream. So this is where my point source is. No, I'm sorry. This is before my point source. So this is where everything's normal. Okay, so that's before the pollution. So let me go ahead and zoom that in so you guys can see it a little bit better. My dissolved oxygen is pretty high, so I'm going to use the same color. So DO is pretty high. Everything's normal. Sorry, DO. Put DO. Dissolved oxygen, pretty high. Now I'm going to get that other color pen. And my biological oxygen demand is pretty low. And that's a good thing. So that's my BOD. That's pretty low. We like that. So we're going to call this the clean zone. This is the clean zone. This is upstream. This is my clean zone. Okay, so what's in my clean zone? And this is what this is for. And if you have to cut that right there, I feel that, because you don't want that sticking out. So this zone supports, supports normal populations. Okay, so you can have a diversity of fishes. You have a lot of fishes, like trout, and perch and bass. So this is where everything's really kind of normal. You're going to have some insect larvae. Really, I should put that there. Okay? Again, your DO is high and your BOD is low, and so that's normal and we like that. Okay? Alright, so immediately at next zone of the river is immediately where we've got that pollution. Okay, so maybe we have like a little pipe here. Okay, and there's some pollution. That's where that point source is. So what happens there is that immediately you get this hike in your BOD. So your BOD increases, and as your BOD increases, guess what happens to your DO? You get this immediate fall or decrease of your DO. We call this the decomposition zone. Decomposition zone. That's where that is, the decomposition zone. Alright, so since this is a little skinnier, I'm going to cut this in half so it'll fit just like that. So this is immediately below source of pollution. So again, maybe it's some sort of sewage pipe or something like that. So you get a DO decrease because decomposers increase. And so therefore you get a BOD increase. Okay, so you get a different fish population, fish that can survive that, like carp. Bullheads, and gar. So these are fish that can survive that low oxygen environment. The problem with carp is that they're not very nutritionally sound with regards to if you're trying to fish for food. They're also quite invasive, and that's because they can live in very low oxygen areas. Alright, so we're going downstream more from the source. Okay, so our dissolved oxygen continues to fall quite significantly. And then, I'm sorry, that's not your dissolved oxygen. That's your BOD. Your BOD kind of dissolves, kind of goes down, and your dissolved oxygen goes down too. Okay, so remember that was the BOD. The reason why the BOD goes down is because your decomposers start to die. And so this is your DO. We call this the septic zone. So there is very little oxygen in here. So we're going to get another, we get the other half here. So this is further downstream. Alright, so nothing but low oxygen needing microbes. They're living here. Maybe some invertebrates. Could live there. So DO starts to increase. And BOD decreases. I'm sorry, BOD decreases. Now, that's because the decomposers have used quite a bit of oxygen, and many of them have died, and so now the oxygen can start coming back. A lot of times this is called a dead zone. So now, mind you, this DO is not back to normal. So it's not back to normal. And that's why we're going to call it the dead zone. A lot of the stuff that could survive here has already died off here. And so all you have are the microbes and the invertebrates. So that's why we're calling it the dead zone. Okay, so I'm going to cut that little tail off at the bottom so it won't stick out. Alright, next zone. This one's called the recovery zone. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one here. Alright, so cool thing happens here is that the DO starts to make a comeback. So a little bit further downstream, we start to see a comeback on that DO, and the BOD starts to decrease significantly. So we get a significant decrease, and so this is going to be called the recovery zone. Now remember, these are just zones of a river. Okay, so this is not about time, this is more distance. Okay, so this is not about time, this is distance in a river. Okay, so here was right at the source, so right at the sewage line or whatever. And a little bit downstream is when we have the septic zone. And then we've got the recovery zone. And so we're seeing the dissolved oxygen increase here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab another sticky. I don't think that sticky fits, so I'm just going to go ahead and make it a little bit shorter. I'm going to put it right there. Those nutrients are all used up. So the nutrients that came from that original pollutant source has been used up. The decomposers have died. So that leaves space for the dissolved oxygen to increase significantly and for an increase in plant photosynthesis. So you start to see the normal communities come back. Sorry, ran out of space there. Okay, and you're going to get your regular fish coming back here. Again, we call this the recovery zone. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that to make it nicer. There's your recovery zone right there. The last zone is our clean zone, so way downstream. way downstream. Okay, so that's our clean zone. Our DO has finally increased quite a bit, and it is stable. And then our BOD is still low. And so this is the, let me go ahead and move this over. This is the clean zone. Okay, so basically you're going to get your nice community of fishes coming back. How it is way upstream before the point source pollution. So again, you're going to have your trout, your perch, your bass, and then of course you're going to have your insects. And of course all of that looks familiar to upstream, way upstream. Okay, and so this is what it looks like when a river gets polluted. So just to kind of quickly go back over that, let me zoom out just a little bit. So before the pollutant event, whether that's a sewage pipe or the exit of a river, I'm sorry, not exit of a river, or the leaching from a farm or something like that, you have a normal population, so fishes, insects, so on and so forth. Normal population, you have plants, and lots of oxygen because rivers are amazing. They're always moving and they're always aerated. So lots of oxygen. So dissolved oxygen is high, BOD is low. Life is good. Everything's normal. And that's called a clean zone, right? So it's clean, everything's normal. But then, of course, you've got some sort of sewage pipe that sprays whatever sewage out, right? Could be sewage or maybe leaching from a pig farm or something like that is your point source. The dissolved oxygen begins to decrease because decomposers are increasing and using up that dissolved oxygen, and so the BOD increases. So the fish that usually would be in the river can't survive, and so you get these type of fish, carp and bullhead and gar, because they're the ones that can live in low oxygen environments. So you'll see that your BOD has increased significantly and your DO has decreased significantly. My lines are not that great. Alright, then you go a little bit further and you hit the septic zone. And so the only thing that's living here are fish that can tolerate, well, not even fish, but microbes that can tolerate low oxygen, maybe some invertebrates. So you have DO that's very low. DO that's starting to increase. It's starting to increase, and BOD that's starting to decrease, but it is still considered a dead zone. Okay, so BOD is starting to increase, but DO is still, it's increasing, but it's still quite low. And so that's the septic zone, sometimes called a dead zone. And the reason why the BOD is starting to decrease is because in this zone, you're getting a lot of those decomposers that have to have oxygen that are dying because there's less oxygen. They've used it all. And so they're dying. And so as they die, the BOD starts to decrease, and you can start seeing the DO start to increase, but it's still very dead, very hypoxic right here. So hypoxia is occurring here. Then we get to the recovery zone, way downstream. The nutrients have been used up. The decomposers are now dead. The DO has increased because of increased plant photosynthesis, and you start to see the normal communities come back. And so that's the recovery zone, and you can see your DO starting to increase and your BOD decreasing. And then you get to the final clean zone, way downstream. and so your normal communities are there, back to the way it was upstream. Okay, and so trout, perch, bass, and all that good jazz. And so our DO is quite high, and our BLD is quite low. And so that's how it works with rivers.